In the late 19th century, deep inside the gilded walls of the Mandalay Palace, there was a king whose name would become synonymous with fear. His reign was short, but his brutality would echo for generations. The story of King Thibaw is not just the story of a monarch, it is the story of a palace soaked in blood, of ambition that devoured an entire dynasty, and of a queen whose influence turned a timid prince into a monster. To understand the horror that unfolded inside those scarlet halls, we must begin with a reality few outside Myanmar truly know. The Burmese throne was never peacefully inherited. It was taken, won, fought for, and sometimes defended with the lives of one's own family. For in the Burmese kingdom, any surviving prince or princess with royal blood could challenge the throne. And that meant one thing. To rule safely, you had to eliminate every threat to your crown. And when King Mindon died in 1878, leaving a fragile court and dozens of eligible heirs, the stage was set for the most terrifying royal purge in Southeast Asian history. Thibaw was never meant to be king. He was quiet, gentle, almost shy. A young prince sent to a monastic school, more comfortable with books than politics. But fate twisted in unexpected ways. His elder brothers fell out of favor. His rivals miscalculated their moves. And most crucially, he caught the attention of the most ambitious woman in the palace, Supayalat. Supayalat, daughter of the powerful Queen Sindhumashin, was intelligent, beautiful, and utterly ruthless. She understood the chaos that would erupt after the king's death. And she knew with frightening clarity that only one path existed to secure the throne for herself and her chosen husband. Every other claimant must disappear. So she pushed Thibaw forward, encouraged him, whispered to him, molded him. And when her mother backed Thibaw as the new king, the royal drums sounded across Mandalay. For a brief moment, it seemed like a peaceful succession had occurred. But peace was a lie. Even before Thibaw's coronation, the palace was trembling with fear. Dozens of princes, princesses, and consorts whispered among themselves, uncertain of their fate. Some believed Thibaw would spare them. After all, he was soft-spoken, hesitant, even kind. But Supayalat was not. And she intended to remove every threat standing between her husband and absolute power. What happened next is one of the most chilling events in Asian royal history. One evening, the royal guards received an order: arrest every prince and princess in the palace. Every child, every adult, every distant cousin. No exceptions. They were told they would merely be relocated for safety. But as the royal family members were herded into a long corridor lined with lacquered floors and golden pillars, something felt wrong. The doors shut behind them. Soldiers with spears lined both sides. And then, Supayalat appeared. With a coldness that froze even the guards, she announced that no rival heirs would live to threaten her husband's throne. She ordered the executions to begin immediately. Men, women, and children, some barely able to walk, were dragged from the line. Their screams echoed through the palace walls. Guards, following orders without hesitation, struck them down. Bodies were thrown into carts. Blood soaked the wooden floors. By the time the massacre ended, over 80 members of the royal family lay dead. And King Thibaw? He watched, silent, paralyzed. A new king realized that he was no longer ruling the empire. He was merely sitting on a throne controlled by his queen. But the horrors were only beginning. The murders unleashed a cycle of fear that spiraled out of control. Ministers trembled. Generals secretly plotted. Ordinary citizens whispered of omens, dark birds landing on palace rooftops, strange echoes at night, the spirits of murdered royals haunting Mandalay. Within months, the once mighty Burmese kingdom was cracking from inside. Rebellions stirred. Foreign powers watched with hungry eyes. And the British Empire saw its perfect opportunity. As Mandalay bled from its own throne, the British prepared to strike. The fall of the Burmese Empire was no longer a question. It was only a matter of time. The massacre inside Mandalay Palace did not stay hidden for long. Blood has a way of seeping through even the thickest walls, and the whispers spread like wildfire. Servants who cleaned the corridors told stories of stains that would not wash away. Palace musicians claimed they heard crying in the night, voices that belonged to no living soul. Even the guards, hardened men who had carried out the killings themselves, refused to walk alone after sunset. Something in the palace had changed. Something had broken. Outside the palace walls, Mandalay City felt the shift. Merchants noticed the sudden silence in the streets around the palace. Monks, usually welcomed warmly, were quietly turned away from certain gates. Rumors of the blood purge traveled through markets, tea houses, and river ports, always in hushed tones, always with eyes darting over shoulders. And everywhere, the blame fell on one name: Supayalat. She had become a figure of fear. A queen whose beauty hid a ruthless hunger. She moved through the palace like a shadow, her footsteps soft, her voice calm, her commands deadly. The ministers bowed low when she passed, but their eyes revealed terror. They knew the line between service and treason had vanished. Any mistake, any suspicion, any moment of perceived disloyalty, and they too could disappear. But while fear ruled the palace, something much more dangerous brewed beyond the kingdom's borders. Far to the south in Rangoon, British officials received detailed reports. The new king was weak. The queen was brutal. The court was divided. The people were losing faith. And the entire Burmese Empire was vulnerable. It was exactly what the British Empire had been waiting for. For decades, Britain had eyed Burma with greed, its teak forests, its rubies, its fertile valleys, its ports along the Irrawaddy River. But the kingdom had been strong under King Mindon, a capable ruler who balanced diplomacy and power. With him gone and chaos swallowing the palace, the British saw their golden chance. And so they began to prepare. Warships were moved closer to Burmese waters. Troops were repositioned in India. Spies and informants infiltrated border towns. And officials crafted a narrative that would justify invasion. Burma's government is unstable. The new king is dangerous. British interests must be protected. Inside Mandalay, Thibaw had no idea how quickly the storm was forming. He sat on the lion throne, wearing garments heavy with gold, jeweled slippers tightening around his feet. But the throne no longer gave him dignity, it caged him. Ministers spoke carefully, choosing every word with precision. Generals bowed deeply, hiding their true opinions. And his own queen monitored every move, every meeting, every whisper. Thibaw began to feel it. The isolation. The fear. The growing realization that he had unleashed something he could never undo. He tried to assert control, meeting governors, issuing decrees, demanding loyalty. But each action revealed the same truth: the monarchy's power was crumbling. Rebels in the northern hills refused to acknowledge him. Shan chiefs withheld tribute. The people, once respectful and loyal, now avoided speaking his name. Even the royal astrologers, men who had served the dynasty for generations, delivered grim predictions. They spoke of bad omens, of a dark cloud approaching from the west, of a throne that would be lost by a king whose hands were stained by the blood of his own. Thibaw listened, trembling. Supayalat ignored them. But fate was already in motion. By the end of 1885, British forces stood ready, their cannons loaded, their ships anchored, their soldiers prepared for a swift, decisive strike. Mandalay Palace still glittered under the sun. But to the trained eye, it was nothing more than a golden coffin. And in just a matter of weeks, the last Burmese king would face the empire that had been waiting for him to fall. By late 1885, the kingdom of Burma felt like a lantern whose flame guttered in the wind. Its glow was still visible, beautiful, defiant, but anyone watching closely knew it was about to go out. The people sensed it. The palace sensed it. Even the air around Mandalay seemed to thicken, as if the entire city were holding its breath. And then, one morning, the storm arrived. British warships appeared on the Irrawaddy River like floating iron monsters, their cannons pointed toward the heart of the kingdom. Columns of soldiers marched with mechanical precision, disciplined, relentless, unstoppable. They met only scattered, desperate resistance along the way. The once mighty Burmese army was fractured, underfed, and stunned by how quickly the enemy advanced. Inside the palace, messengers sprinted through teak corridors, delivering reports that grew darker by the hour. Fort after fort had fallen. Defenses crumbled. And now, The British were at the gates of Mandalay itself. Thibaw and Supayalat were cornered. The king sat frozen on his throne, his face pale, his hands trembling. This was not the powerful monarch he once attempted to be. This was a man swallowed by fear. Fear of the British, fear of rebellion, fear of the consequences of the massacre that had opened his reign. Supayalat, however, remained unbroken. She paced the room like a caged tigress, her eyes burning with fury. Servants and ministers kept their distance, terrified of what she might do in her desperation. The queen refused to surrender, refused to bow, refused to let the British write the final chapter of her dynasty. But reality had already sealed their fate. British officers sent an ultimatum. Surrender immediately, or the palace will burn. The ministers begged the king to yield. Generals warned that the soldiers could not hold defenses even for a day. And as the sun dipped lower, the golden rooftops of Mandalay Palace shimmered like melting metal, beautiful and doomed. Supayalat's rage finally cracked. She shouted at the council, cursed the officers, accused the ministers of betrayal. But her voice, once feared, now sounded hollow. She could not stop what was coming. She could not undo the massacre that had sparked it. The dynasty's end was already written. In the early morning hours of November 29, 1885, King Thibaw and Queen Supayalat surrendered. British troops entered the palace in near silence, boots thudding softly on polished floors. They expected chaos, revolt, traps. Instead, they found a palace drained of life, only servants weeping quietly in corners, court ladies hiding behind columns, and guards who laid down their weapons without a fight. The golden lion throne stood untouched, a symbol of power that no longer belonged to the king who once sat upon it. Thibaw emerged slowly, dressed in his royal robes, a final attempt to preserve dignity. But even then the world saw not a king, but a man broken by fear and regret. Supayalat followed beside him, tears in her eyes but fire in her expression. She did not cry for the kingdom. She cried for her pride, for her fall from the pinnacle of power to the humiliating walk toward exile. As the royal family was escorted out of the palace, crowds gathered to watch. Some mourned, some whispered, some stared in shock, and some secretly felt a cold sense of justice. For many had lost sons, brothers, and husbands in the ruthless massacre that cemented Thibaw's rule. The royal barge waited on the riverbank. The British forced Thibaw and Supayalat onto a bullock cart, intentionally stripping them of dignity. The last Burmese king, heir to 1,000 years of monarchs, left his palace not on a throne, not on an elephant, not with royal ceremony, but in a simple wooden cart creaking toward the river. Women cried. Men bowed their heads. Monks stood silently as the cart rolled past. And Supayalat, even in that final moment, looked back at the palace with a stare so fierce that even the British officers felt a chill. The royal family was taken far away, first to Madras, then to Ratnagiri, a lonely coastal town in India. There they lived in quiet isolation, prisoners of an empire that now ruled their homeland. Thibaw never returned to Burma. He died in exile, lonely, heartbroken, forgotten by the world he once commanded. Supayalat outlived him by decades. Even in exile, she remained proud, defiant, and unrepentant. She carried the guilt of the massacre like a buried stone, never admitting it, never apologizing, never letting the world see any crack in her iron will. And Mandalay? The palace survived, but the monarchy did not. The massacre that began Thibaw's reign had triggered the chain of events that ended it. The blood he spilled to secure the throne became the stain that washed it away. This is the tragic story of the last king of Burma, a kingdom destroyed not only by foreign ambition, but by the shadows of fear, paranoia, and the haunting consequences of absolute power.